This show is sponsored by the law firm of Tony Kalagarakis and Associates.
إيمان وايلة أكسيدنت اتنرابة ناشة ليطي متبصل طاقة شكلي. اتلا نسيانة بدنا كيسس ات injury law. و بيالباية قريمخ. إن آتن ينكل بتت بيتا خزموخن يطانة اتلوخن بوقارة مخبرون المنيان التلفون 8 أربع شوا وشو 8 تري وشو 5 خا إشتا يعني توكن بيت injuryrights.com. شمي إلى توني كالاغراكس كي يمزمن لشان خلية يما.
شلام عليكم. أنا ريبيكا سايمون. مجيبت يداعة شاميران قبول أخوي ممشينة. يومت خطريشن بلجت يداعة شاميران أرخي قاتوخون مديتيلا همزن تنويتلا باتا الباتا مني. إنا آخر زمتا بخدجة بريشة. سبب همزمتم دوية من خام يقرطة إنا باسد تري يقرياتي. سبب يقرطة تري خينا الباتا أرى ليلة. همزمتم دوية من ميقرطة شبنم ساميول قد يشيتت ألبو الجامو اشتيخا جابت هندوستان الدنيا تيتلا خا سامو آتوريتلا وطلا سامو هندواي خادانا كتابة كتفتلا بشمت A Fractured Life باست نانونتو آتوريتا قد شمو إيوة سوسمبر راشو ومجر خيوت دانتري ميدال بشتلا سقرتا سوسمبر راشو أغمارنا بلكد يوشيتت ألبو الجامو إشتا ين ألبو الجامو شوا جابد ماتت جانجاتشن أورمي الدنيا بيتايلة بخشافخ إدمتت شوا ين 18 نوفا جانو وأباهو وخاتو وأخونواتو من أورمي بلاطنا برخشنا روسيا بتخاطرت قتل وبرامت أطوراي جابد إيران من بردية خيوتت مارتت سوسمبر شارويلا و شبنم باسدها بكتابله مغبن إن إنجلس رابس بايليتون بدايا بس مالخون هيارت شغليتون من خانشة قد أهم زمتقاتوخون باشغله سبب إيلا خسامة رابس سودنته من تشئيت ديان آتوراي قد رابا بغدايخ أدية قاتوخون معي عادي بطالبخ من شبنم من همزمة Hello Shabnam Samuel. Welcome to Shamiran Media. We're very pleased to have you on our program.
Thank you so much for having me, Rebecca. I can't tell you what this means to me. To be sitting here and listening to you speak in Assyrian, which is my grandmother's language, makes me feel so emotional inside. I just can't express it. Thank you so much for doing this.
And that is so heartwarming for you to say that to us. Thank you very much. Shabnam, please take us to the turn of the last century, early 1900s, when your grandmother, Susember Rasho, left Iran along with her family. Tell us why she did that.
So as we all know by now, my grandmother was born sometime in 1906 or 1907. In Gangachin in Urmi. The reverberation of the Ottoman Empire had already started. The onslaught, the victimization, the religious persecution had already started. So that was no longer a safe zone for them. So my grandmother and her family took refuge with the Soviet Union, the armies that had come out to help them, and somehow found their way back to the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. And we are thinking she's settled in either Tbilisi or Donetsk, somewhere in that area of Ukraine and Georgia, which is the current day Ukraine and Georgia. And again, they couldn't settle down. The strife continued. The Russian Revolution happened. World War I was breaking out. So the family got scattered again. And so my grandmother, her father was already killed before they left the Soviet Union. Her mother had died. And so she and her younger brother and some uncles and aunts and cousins started the trek down from, whichever point in Russia they were in. They started walking down to wherever they were going. They didn't know they were headed to a refugee camp. It was an exodus, as we all know. So they all just kept walking and walking till they got to the refugee camp in Iraq.
And what about her older sister? Did she?
My grandmother had an older sister and a younger brother. The older sister was a couple of years older than my grandmother, and she was left back in wherever they were in Russia with an aunt because she was of marriageable age. They thought they would get her married to somebody there and send her away. They didn't want to send a young girl, I guess, on the trek. Who knows what they were thinking?
Do you know what her name was, Shabnam?
Her name was Raisa or Rapka. So she's known with both the names, Raisa and Rapka. So we don't know whether one was before marriage or after marriage, but my grandmother called her Rapka. So we are going to stay with Rapka. So she stayed back then. We are thinking must have been maybe 13 or 14, and my grandmother must have been, somewhere maybe 8 or 9 or something like that. We still don't know the exact ages. Maybe she was 12 or 13, and the older sister was a few years older. So whatever was done, they started walking down, and my grandmother had her younger brother with her, whose name is Nikolai Rasho. And we're thinking, and I call him Grandpa Nico, he must have been 2 or 3 years younger than my grandmother. So we're putting my grandmother in her teens and him in his early teens. So then they reached the refugee camp. We don't know the exact year, but they stayed there for a couple of years.
Where was the refugee camp?
In Baghdad.
Baghdad.
It was in Baghdad, but again, I've heard there are 2, 3 other. After doing a lot of research, I've been told there are 2, 3 different camps in Baghdad during that time. But this was the Red Cross camp in Baghdad, and that's all we knew. So they were at the camp. After 2 or 3 years, her younger brother Nikolai disappeared from the camp. He
just disappears. One day she comes and he's not there.
She had started working as a nurse's assistant, helping out in the camp and all of that. And one day she came back and Nikolai was gone. He must have been 11, 12, 13, somewhere in that. And my grandmother was maybe 15, 16. So she had, she was devastated. That was her only connection to her family. During that time, the First World War had already broken out. Now, my Indian grandfather, was a soldier in the British Army because India was ruled by the Britishers at that point.
What was his name, please? What was his name?
So Edward Benjamin Samuel was his name.
A very westernized name.
Well, he had an Indian name. His name was Bidyut Samuel. But when he joined the English forces, it was difficult for the Britishers to pronounce his name. So I am told at that point, they changed a lot of names for the soldiers, the Indian soldiers who joined. They anglicized their names so that it would be easier for the officers to, pronounce their names or call out to them. So from Bidyut Samuel, my grandfather became Edward Benjamin Samuel.
And that's why your last name is Samuel. This is your maiden name.
Yes, that's why my last name is Samuel. So he was fighting the war for the British in Iraq. And he was also part of the YMCA, which is the Young Men's Christian Association from back home in India. And so the YMCA used to organize prayer meetings in the camp.
Was he Christian? Was your grandfather Christian?
Yes. My grandfather was a Christian, yes. His mother had converted and become a Christian to marry his father. So that's a whole different story. But yes, we were all Christians, starting from my grandfather down. So they had prayer meetings there, for the patients, for the nurses, for the staff. And that's where he saw my grandmother. And she had reddish hair and blue eyes and all of that. And he was fascinated by her. That's what we were told. But, much later he says, no, he was just doing a good deed. So all of that.
A little bit of
he wanted
each, perhaps.
I think so. I think so. But then remember, they didn't speak each other's language. My grandmother didn't even know English. So she, she knew, I guess she grew up speaking Assyrian. And then she would also, learn some Arabic words while living in Baghdad. So he didn't know how to communicate with her. So he, through her head nurse, sent a message saying he wanted to marry her and take her back with him to India. So when the proposal was sent to her through the head nurse, my grandmother refused, saying she didn't know where India was. She didn't know who this dark person was. She had never seen somebody like him before in her life. And they couldn't speak the same language. So where would she go? She didn't want to go. So then her head nurse, I'm told, told her that, look, the war is getting over. This camp is going to close down. You have no family left. We have to do something for you. So all that convincing back and forth went. I guess my grandmother realized, she had lost everybody. The young brother that she had disappeared. There was no contact with family back home or any relatives or anything. So then she finally gave in and said, okay, I'll marry you. So March 10th of 1922, they got married in the refugee camp in Baghdad.
So she was about 16 or 17 or so, about that
You're
age.
right. Yes. And my grandfather must have been 22 or 23. So that's where they got married. And I think after that, they lived for a couple of months in Baghdad. He'd taken a house on rent and while he finished up his duties. And then they boarded a ship and sailed from Baghdad to Bombay, which was Bombay then. So that's how she came to India. And, when she landed in India, everything was so different. The language, the people, the crowds. And I have to remember that she was also so young. So she had forgotten a lot of her history also. But she came to, so my grandfather then brought her to our hometown, which is Cuttack, where he had his relatives. And he was also young. He had no job. He was just a soldier then. And so for them, it was a starting point. But his extended family welcomed her. Some of them did. Most of them did. And then my grandfather applied for government positions. And he just rose through the ranks and rose and rose. And then they traveled throughout India with my grandfather's job. And he was still part of the British government because the British was still in India till 1947. And so they traveled to different places, had 7 children. She learned the language. She learned English. So every state in India has their own language. She learned how to speak the language of our state, which is Oriya. And she learned 2 other languages, including our national language, which is Hindi. So she fully immersed herself into our Indian way of living, except for her clothes. She could never ever wear a sari or, a salwar kameez that we wear. She couldn't. She just couldn't manage it.
Do you know why?
So
Do you know why she wouldn't wear a sari?
she tried. She told us that she tried, but she was very short. She was only 4 feet 4 inches. And the sari is about 6 feet long, I think. So to wrap that thing around you it takes a lot. It takes a lot of skill. And she didn't
She learned 4 languages, English and 3 Indian dialects.
Yes.
Do you think perhaps she wanted to hold on to her past by at least her clothing? Do you think that ever happened in her mind psychologically?
I think so. I think she did. I think she did. I think that was her last vestige of, clinging on to her past. And I think that's why she did it. Yes.
But she never said so, right? She never admitted that could have been the reason.
Right. She would never really, she would tell us a lot of stories. I grew up with her because my grandparents adopted me as a child. So I grew up with her. but we are 21 cousins and we're all very close. So, most summer holidays or winter holidays, all the kids would come and she would tell us these stories. And now when I go back and think about it, she would talk about this lake. She would talk about horses. She would, and I'm thinking it's the Lake Urmi, which used to be there. She would tell us, I've been reading books, other Assyrian authors have written, and I see so many similarities now in her stories that she used to tell us. But for us, it was like, okay, she's making up a story. And we as children never really bothered to ask her, what is this or what is that? And so, that was there with her. She told us a lot of stories, and I think they were all stories from her past. Now that I
Did
connect
she
the
ever
dots.
mention the word Assyrians at all to you guys, if you remember?
No, we always used to think she was a Russian because, my grandfather used to, and I don't think my grandfather also, asked her too many questions maybe in the beginning because they couldn't communicate with the same language. It was difficult. And by the time she learned the language and they started communicating, that chapter of her life was far left behind. They had kids to look after, places to go. So he never really asked her. So we all thought my grandmother was Russian. Never did we think, Assyrian. I had heard of Syria. I had never heard of Assyrian.
You're not the only one.
Yes.
Many people have not heard of Assyrians. They think we are Syrians. So we have to make a point of telling people we are Assyrian.
Yeah. So that's what it was. And, it was only when my aunt, which is one of her daughters, my mother's older sister, started doing her research and all of that, that's when more of the truth came out.
So
But she
didn't even talk to her children about Assyrians. I mean, they didn't know that she was Assyrian either. Not
No,
just
I
the
think
grandchildren, but even the children.
I think very late in life did they start asking their mother the questions. At least I don't see. I wasn't there, so I can't speak for it. But but I think all that happened very late. So the kids were growing up. The kids had were in boarding school. Far away from their parents. So I don't know how much of interaction they had for these kind of issues. And something about our Indian culture, we don't really talk about things that are sad or bad or, all of that. Everything is kept far away so that it doesn't affect your current life. So maybe that was part of not finding things out. And so I think she had basically silenced herself because she had thought that, what's the point? My family is gone. I think she gave up in her mind, in her heart. She gave up about she having her own family.
So, and sometimes that's a coping mechanism just to avoid your pain.
Right. And, but, though every now and then she would make wine. And
she would make, I'm sorry, she would make what?
Wine.
Wine.
Drinking wine.
Yes.
And that is something most Indians at that point didn't really do.
That's an Urmi thing.
Yes. And
we
then
had
she would
vast
tell us,
acres of vineyards in Urmi.
Right. And, she would tell us, there was this horse and we went riding and this little girl jumped on and then we squished on, we jumped on the grapes. So we were like, what is she talking about? And then she would make them and she knew how to make them. That's the best thing. So now I think back, it's okay. She has seen her parents do that. So she knows that. So she would make wine, then she made dolma. So there were these little things that would come out. But not really sit there and tell us about her dad or her mom or, she would tell us stories of, there used to be this chieftain, who was very tall and handsome, and he used to go help people in other villages, and then a young prince, she would spin stories like that. But now I look back and say, these were all her stories she was telling us.
So you know all
So
these stories by memory. At the time, you didn't document them. You just have them by memory.
by memory, yep. I
And
didn't
you are
document
the daughter of which child out of the 7 children?
the youngest child, youngest daughter.
A daughter. You're the daughter of her daughter, the youngest daughter,
Correct. The youngest daughter.
the youngest
yes.
child.
Youngest child, who's a daughter, and I'm her daughter. Yes.
None of the siblings of your mother, the children, had Assyrian names, did they?
Not really Assyrian names. They all had what we call English names. Like my mother's name is Mabel. My eldest uncle's name was Charles. My other auntie's name was Dora, Nora, Eric, and Edwin. So they all had English names. And I don't know if that came from my grandmother or they named the children because the British was still ruling India and they needed to have names that were easy to pronounce. I don't know what it is. So,
Growing up, Shabnam, with your grandmother, did you ever see any other signs of Assyrianism from her besides dolma? Anything else that now, looking back in retrospect, you say, that was an Assyrian thing to do or an Assyrian thing to say besides her stories?
her mannerisms, the way she speaks. Now, growing up in India, I had never met another Assyrian. When I came here, actually, I met her brother in India, but I was 14, 15 then, didn't pay much attention. But then I went to California last year and met up with her relatives there. And when each of them talk, I see her talking. Her mannerisms, her, the way her hand gestures, the tone in her voice, how she's, it's a typical way of speaking. We Indians have a typical way of speaking, and the Assyrians have a typical, like when I hear you speak, I'm reminded of, one of my aunts, the way she speaks, or a cousin. So all that is now coming back, and I'm saying, okay, that is who she was. That is who, what she was doing. And she sang some lullabies, which I still remember this, but I don't know if my words are correct. So
Can
she
you
used to
say a little
sing-
bit of the lullabies? Even though if it's incorrect, we're thrilled to hear it.
So she would say, Akchi Nanun and Shushan, Whiskey Madnikit Nishan, and I must be saying it all wrong. Pas Kardujam Durdanagan Dilam Dilam. That was once lullaby she used to sing to us all the time. I have no idea if I'm saying it correct, but I have the tune in my head and her words in my mind, and that's what it was. And so some things I just can't explain. It's difficult to imagine someday from an entirely different world, different language, different everything, giving up all of that and taking on a new identity. It's just very hard to fathom.
Did she have an accent in the 4 languages that she learned? Did she have an Assyrian
Yes.
accent? She did.
Yes, she did.
The fact that she was red-headed, blue-eyed, and had an accent, did that cause any prejudice among Indians for her?
I'll have to say no. India at that point was such an open and wonderful country. And we lived in a small town. She stood out. She definitely stood out, and people used to stare at her or wonder where did she come from. All of that did happen, but no insults, no derogatory remarks, nothing like that. She was accepted very warmly, and she was a very warm-hearted person also. She helped out in the society a lot, but she was accepted thoroughly, absolutely with open arms and everything. So no prejudice.
Now, you say there are 21 grandchildren, am I correct?
Correct.
But
From her 17.
you, of all the grandchildren, have a special affinity for your grandmother, and there's a special connection between you and Susember Rasho. Please tell
Right.
us about that.
Well, so my parents divorced when I was a kid. They separated when I was about 6 months old. And
In India. In India.
in India, correct. So, with all that strife that was going on, I have an older brother. So my older brother and myself were left with our grandparents in Cuttack, my Assyrian grandmother and Indian grandfather. So while my parents sorted out their differences. And so we went back and forth starting from when I was 6 months old. We went back and forth from my grandparents' house to where my parents lived. But eventually they couldn't reconcile. So my father took my brother and left, and my mother had me. And so she came back to Cuttack, which was our hometown, where my grandfather and grandmother lived. And we lived there for a little while. I think I was maybe 4 or 5. And then around when I was 6 or 7, she chose to get married again. And
Your mother. Your mother.
Yes, my mother chose to get married again. So she left home to get married, and I wasn't part of her getting married and going with her. So I stayed on with my grandparents, and when I was 9, I was legally adopted by them, and my name was changed from my dad's last name to my grandparents' last name. And so they are actually my parents because I've known them from day one. I actually call my grandfather Papa. I've never called my dad or my mom. But I don't know why I've never called my grandmother mommy or ma or whatever. I've always called her granny. And people would ask me that, how come you call him Papa and you call her granny? And I have no explanation. I just don't know. But they were my
Did
parents.
she want you to call her granny? Or just...
all the other older cousins called her granny, and they called my grandfather Papa or Daddy. So that's how it was, I guess. And
By the way, did she keep her Susember Assyrian name, or did she change it to an Indian name or Western name?
She kept it. No, she kept it.
She kept it.
She kept it, yeah. She kept Susember Rasho, yep. Not the last name. She was Susember Samuel after that. So they are actually my parents, even though, biologically they are my grandparents, but, for all purposes, they are my parents. She raised me. She did whatever a mother was supposed to do, both of them, he and she. So that's why I'm technically the last child of, the Samuels. So that's how my affinity to her is so strong. Excuse me.
For how long did you live with her and with your grandfather?
Till I got married when I was 23.
So you lived with her for a couple of decades, about 2 decades.
23 years, yep.
So you got to know her very well besides her own children.
Yes, I knew her the best because, when the children were in boarding school, so by the time they finished school, then they went off to college, some went into the military. So they never really stayed at home with their parents. But I was the one who stayed home.
Did you ever have a sense that she had a depressed mood at times, unknown depressed mood, something that was kind of melancholical about her, that she wasn't always all that happy because of what had gone on with her?
Oh, definitely. She was definitely not present all the time. She would, most of her time, and by the time I came along, she was a little older, so she had slowed down also a little. But most of her days were spent, we had this long veranda at home, and she had we call them an easy chair, like an armchair at one corner. And she would just sit there, stare into space, talk to herself. And I know she was communicating with somebody. She was trying to tell somebody something. So I've seen those moods of hers.
Could you
That
make out the words that she was saying? Or what
No.
language they were?
It was definitely not English or Hindi or anything of that. It definitely wasn't. And again, I regret that because I never asked her. I never paid attention. I never, thought that it was important enough to ask. And, that's a regret. But she was definitely lost in her world a lot of times. And she, later on, she did tell me about her older sister, her younger brother. She had another younger brother who died. So she would talk of them, and she would wonder, I don't know where they are. I don't know where they are. So she would say things like that.
Did she ever reconnect with them?
Yes. So one of her daughters, my mother's older sister, lived in Germany, was married and lived in Germany. So around 1973-74, she started researching, trying to connect with her, trying to go back to the roots of the refugee camp and see if she could find anything there. So she finally got in touch with somebody from the Red Cross camp, and they connected her with a gentleman who gave her the address of where her brother was, the one who disappeared from the refugee camp. And he apparently had left the camp, had gotten into, some sort of skirmish somewhere, had gone underground for a while, and then came back up and was trying to live his life, had married an Armenian girl, and was settled in Baghdad. And the older sister was in Russia. So my aunt did dig out all that information. Finally, I think it was 1977, she managed to fly my grandmother's brother, Nikolai, and his wife from Iraq to India to meet the sister after 66 years. This was in 1977.
Incredible.
They came to India and stayed with us, I think, for about 2 months. My grandfather took them to all the kids' homes in different cities. And in 1980, again, this aunt in Germany flew my grandmother out to Russia, to Donetsk, which was former Soviet Union then, to meet her older sister. And they met after 70 odd years. So they did meet
Amazing
up.
that they were all alive at the same time.
Yes.
To reconnect. How did they
Yes.
communicate?
So when the brother came to India, of course, he didn't know English. She spoke English, but there was she couldn't speak Assyrian. So it was all sign language. But, when you're siblings, when you have that bond, I don't think you really need a language. It was a little frustrating sometimes when you're trying to say something. But then his wife, Azadui auntie, knew some English. So she would, kind of try to mend things and say a few things. And then more of gestures. But, for them, I think it was just seeing each other, and they look like twins. Actually, all three of them look alike. And I sent you some pictures so you can see how the similarity is. So they connected, of course, they couldn't talk about the past, like, where were you when this happened, or what happened then. If you don't have the language, then it's difficult to join a story together. But I guess they were just happy seeing each other. And the same thing happened when she went to Russia. They couldn't speak the language, but they were just happy to be in each other's company. I think for my grandmother, just going back to her roots was just, I don't even know what she must have felt. So it's...
Did you sense that after meeting her siblings, decades later, that there was a change in her mood, that something had resolved within her?
Yes and no. I think she also had a lot of regrets. After she came back, she would be a little, maybe she was thinking, what if I had lived there? What if our family had been normal? What if the war hadn't happened? We would have been we would have been one big family with cousins and kids and grandkids. So maybe that was part of it. And also, after coming back, she knew this was not going to happen again. So that must have been some sort of, it must have had a negative effect on her. I think so. I think it did have a negative effect on her. So,
Did she ever request the family to take her back to Urmi, to her roots?
I don't think she knew that. I don't think she knew where Urmi was anymore. I don't think maybe the trauma of everything, or maybe she just didn't know how to express where she came from and we don't know about it. But not once have I heard her mention Urmi or Gangachin. No, Gangachin, yes. Urmi, I don't think she knew that word. So, but she did say, she would always say Gangachin. So I think she remembered that.
Now, I assume that her siblings are long gone. And how did your grandmother pass away, and when?
My grandmother passed away in 1993. She lived, I think, almost 90. She was strong. She wasn't healthy, but she was strong. But she died of a heat stroke. So Cuttack can get very, very hot, my hometown. And she refused to have an AC installed. The kids wanted to, put it. You don't have central heat, central air there. So we wanted a unit for her, and she refused that. And it was a heat stroke, and she just passed away. Yeah.
How did your grandfather pass away, and when?
So he was ailing, and he passed away in 1985, and he was 87, I think, when he passed away.
Did you ever hear him saying he wished he married an Indian woman, and that the cultural differences and languages and some barriers were there? Did you ever hear him say that?
No, I've never heard him say that. And, he would... no, I didn't. I think also because of the time he grew up, where the British were in India, so we were used to foreigners, quote unquote, in our land, because the Britishers were there all over. So my grandfather was very adaptable. And with my grandmother, he never really differentiated, never really, said mean things. They would fight, yes, but he would never say things like, I wish I hadn't married you, or I've never heard him say that. Maybe in the younger days he might have, but not when I was there. He never did.
Shabnam, you yourself have had your share of sadness in your life. Tell us a little about your challenges. It's not easy to be left by your mother and be raised by your grandparents without your brother, sibling. Tell us a little bit about your life.
So I've told you a little that, my mother got married and she moved on to a different life. And so the person that she married, she moved out to be with him, and they were starting life anew. There was no place for a child, especially someone else's child. So by that time, my brother was already with my father. So it was just automatic that I stayed with my grandparents, and my mother gave up her legal rights over me so that my grandfather could adopt me. And so that's where I lived. I mean, yes, in a small town that I grew up in, it was difficult because, people do ask questions. Like, when you go to school, the kids ask you, where are your parents? Why are your parents so old? Or why didn't they come for sports day? Or things like this, things little children without meaning any harm say to each other. And it was difficult because my mother was married in the same city, and I would see her every day. She was a school teacher. So we had 3 major schools in Cuttack that time when we were growing up. So I was in a different school, and she was a teacher in a different school. And every day life would play out in front of me. I would see her in the rickshaw going to school, but not acknowledge each other because she couldn't tell anybody that she had a daughter. Because society doesn't, it's difficult for our society, Indian society, to accept a divorced woman or a woman who had a child to get married. So there was all those taboos going on there. And so that's what happened. So I grew up seeing my mother every day. I grew up seeing her have one kid, then I saw another kid. So from the very beginning, I knew I had half siblings. But unfortunately, my half siblings didn't know I was their older sister because I was kept away from all of that. My mother was not allowed to come back to our family home. So that's how I grew up in Cuttack.
So your grandparents, your grandfather was pretty westernized. So your grandparents never did intervene asking your mother to come and visit you every now and then.
No, my grandfather actually didn't want her to get married, or even if she got married, to keep the children with her. So once she decided that she didn't want the children and had to, make a life for herself, my grandfather actually told her that she wasn't allowed to come back home. So she didn't come back to our ancestral home.
Did you ever visit your father and your brother?
No.
So in a way, your life mirrored your grandmother's life through different avenues.
Yes, you're right. Yes. And I guess that's why this affinity with her is so strong.
And so now you're 20-some years old and you're in India. You get married. Who do you marry and how was your marriage?
So now I'm in India. A couple of things have happened along the way during my teen years. I had a couple of surgeries, which if when somebody reads my book, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about, because if I talk now, it'll go for 5 hours. But so by the time I was 21, 22, all my friends were getting married, my classmates were getting married. And having said all of that about Cuttack, it is still, you were still not allowed to go date. They were all arranged marriages. Now, the Christian community in Cuttack, where I grew up, is very small. There were very few people that one could choose and get married to. So my grandfather had started looking for boys for me, and he found a couple of boys that just I could not have ever married them. And so I finished my master's, came back to Cuttack, and I started working at an ad agency. How old was I? I was 20. I was 22, and started working at this ad agency. And my life was closing in. My grandparents were getting older, so they wanted to marry me off before something happened to them. And I didn't know what to do. So somebody who worked at the agency, I got to know him. He proposed, and I said yes. And I knew him, I think, for a month. So for me, that was an avenue out, because here was somebody artistic, somebody who drew, who wrote poetry, and all those things are what I do also. So I thought, okay, maybe this is somebody that I can live with.
So you didn't marry out of love. You married out of duty to your grandparents.
Not duty. I rebelled and got married because my husband was a Hindu, and that was a no-no. I was going out of my religion to get married. He was 20 years older than me. That was another no-no. So basically, I walked out of the house to get married so that I didn't marry somebody that my grandfather chose for me.
How did that affect your relationship with the Susember and your grandfather?
It was bad for a few months. It was really, really bad. I actually walked out of the house, and I've made them both cry a lot the months preceding my marriage. It's a regret that I will live with all my life. But I did what I did, which I thought was my way out of that situation, because I didn't want to marry somebody who I couldn't, communicate with mentally. And I did that, but, when you're 22, you don't know much about life. You don't know things. I got married when I was 23, and things changed. I didn't know anything about being a Hindu. I didn't know anything about being a housewife. There were so many things that I didn't know. I didn't know customs and cultures. They were so different from ours. And so that's where the rift began. We couldn't communicate. I mean, art and everything is fine at work, but that art doesn't happen at home, or poetry doesn't happen at home. It's real life at home. And then I had my son at 24, and even though I knew from day one that this marriage wouldn't work, there was nothing I could do, because I couldn't go back to my grandparents and say, okay, I made a mistake, I want to come back. I couldn't do that. I couldn't go to any uncles or aunts or any of my cousins. And so that door closed on me, and, I had no income. So a couple of friends of mine who knew what I was going through helped me set up an advertising agency. That's my field. So I ran my agency for about 3 years in India. And then my first husband was actually, and we moved to America because my first husband was an immigrant. He got his paperwork after studying here. And so I chose to come here. I was insistent.
By first husband, you mean the husband that is the father of your son, the Hindu husband. That's who you mean correct. By your first husband. Yes.
Yeah. So we came here to America, and I thought, America would be where I would get away, where I could do whatever I want to do. It's the land of freedom, I would have rights, I would have choices.
Was your grandmother alive by the time you migrated?
Yeah. Yes. My grandmother actually looked after my son. He was born in my home in Cuttack, and she basically took care of him while I came to work. I went to work. She didn't know anything about my marriage being in trouble or anything. I never told them. So we migrated here when my son was 3.5. Came to America, and I thought I could do this and could do that, but I didn't realize that I had to start working, and to survive you had to work. There was nothing here that I could do. I couldn't go back to school and study because we didn't have those kind of finances. So and then my son started school, was growing up, and it was just I could never do anything for myself. I mean, I worked up the corporate ladder, did everything, but it was a marriage of silence. There was no marriage there, but I stayed because financially I was bound. And I tried to leave a couple of times, went and came back again because of finances. And, I have no family here. So nobody knew, even in India, nobody knew all this was going on.
Was there any abuse in your marriage? Or it was just not meeting of the minds? So there was abuse.
There was a lot of mental and vocal abuse, and he did raise his hand a couple of times on me. There was some form of physical abuse, but I still stayed. When my son went to college, I did move out. I've moved out a couple of times. It always came back when my son was younger. Moved with my son. But came back again because, I couldn't see myself renting a basement and staying there till my son finished high school. Or renting a room in somebody's house, because I could never afford anything on my own. And eventually, after my son finished college, I did move out. And, I said, okay, now this is my time. But again, as fate would have it, Arun, which is my son's father, was diagnosed with cancer. So I came back into the house, and basically we never got divorced. So we were married for 25 years till he passed away in 2008.
So then he passes away. Did you remarry? Because you said your
Yes,
first husband.
I yes, I did get married in 2012, and that's a whole different story. I can't, I don't usually talk about him.
That's
I
fine.
I did get married again. Yes.
Are you happy?
Yes.
Now, how does your son relate to your life story, your grandparents' story? Is he interested? He is how old now?
He is 34, and yes, he's absolutely connected because he grew up in Cuttack. He was born in that house that I was born in. My grandmother raised him, so he remembers every inch of her, every dialogue of hers, and I have tons of pictures. So he hasn't forgotten that, and he has been my greatest strength, actually. So even though he was very connected to his dad, but he still understood what was going on. And I remember, he must have been 13 or 14. We were sitting outside on the porch, and he says, like, "Mom, why are you still here?" So, he, like I said, he's been my greatest strength. So,
And if I do my math correctly here, he's 1/8 Assyrian.
yes, yes. And
Now, what do you do for a living, Shabnam, now?
so I work for a healthcare insurance company. I live in Maryland. I work full time. I do some research work for them, and yeah, that's what I do. In my spare time, I write. I have a few classes that I take. I teach online creative writing classes. I run a writers retreat once a year in India. So that's what I do.
Which I'm very interested in. You have a writers retreat. With the coronavirus, that's probably on hold. But I am eyeing that retreat. Just to let you know. Hold me a spot.
I will, and I would love to take you to India and show you some beautiful sights there. Yes.
Shabnam, have you made amends with your mother, your father? Are they living, your brother?
So my father passed away a long time ago. I've just met him once in my life, and I didn't fancy meeting him again, and I didn't want to. My mother, I talk about her in my book. She actually passed away last week.
Oh, I'm so sorry. In India or
Yes.
here?
In India. She passed away on the 2nd of June. She was suffering. She had already slipped into dementia. So yeah, she's people ask me after I wrote my book, have you forgiven your mom? And I don't think it was a question of forgiving. It was just a question of analyzing things for myself when I wrote the book, because I wanted to write what I felt. But I don't hold anything against her. Maybe she could have done things different, but then I wasn't in her shoes. I can't make judgments. I'm not perfect myself. So I don't hold any grudges. I have regrets, like, when I would see her with my half sister or half brother, I would wonder, how come she doesn't think about us? How come, she doesn't feel? So those were the questions I had in my mind. But when you don't know somebody, you really can't hold a grudge. I don't think you can hold a grudge on a stranger. Can you? I don't think that's possible. So for me, she was a stranger, so I let it be at that, and but again, she was my mother. So I had certain questions in my mind or certain answers that I needed, which I actually never did get, because by the time I had the courage to ask those questions, she had already slipped into dementia. So
what about her children? Can you get any information from her children, her two other children? Your half siblings?
My half sibling found out about 10 years ago, I think, that I was her sister. She didn't know before that because, the truth was hidden. They would always say that I was adopted and, stayed with my grandparents. So my half siblings didn't know who I was.
Did any of your 6 aunts and uncles ever visit her, talk to her, even if it was in a hiding fashion?
Yes.
They did.
Yes.
Did they tell
Because-
you? Yes. Go ahead.
So I'm sorry. So they did, yes, and because my grandfather never knew about it, and no, they wouldn't tell me they went there. But she did come back to the house when my youngest uncle was migrating to Australia. He told his father that before I leave, I want my sister back in the house. And I still remember that day my grandfather locked me up in his room while my mother and her husband and the 2 kids came.
Did you know she was there? Did you know your
yeah.
mother was at home?
Yep. Yeah. So, and then I think after then she started coming slowly, maybe once a month, and then it became twice a month. She would come and sit and talk to her mother. Her husband used to come, but I was kept far away from all of that. Then when I went off to college in Delhi, I think they started coming a little more. My grandfather was getting older. I guess he was, his anger was going down or his helplessness was coming up. And so they were there. But I never really had any communication with them.
Did you really want to see her and sit down and talk to her, hug her? Did you have that desire?
No,
You didn't.
not at all. Because there was no nurturing feeling. There was no bond
Connection.
there. So there was no connection at all. I mean, I would look forward to my aunts and uncles coming or my cousins coming more than, my mother or... I mean, I did, when I saw my half-sister and half-brother, I did have feelings about them. But again, they didn't know who I was. So I couldn't really say, hey, I'm your older sister,
Did anybody, any of the aunts or uncles or any relatives ever tell you that your mother really wanted to see you and get to know you, but under the circumstances she couldn't? Did you have that closure, that satisfaction?
No, she never did, because I don't think that ever came, because remember, she was the one who gave us up. So I don't think she ever wanted that. Maybe she regretted it later, and might have wanted to change things, but it was too late by then.
Is this still a significant event in your life, or you've just closed it and put it in the forgotten file? Or is it something that every day you need to work on it to go on?
No, it's so I gave it closure. A little incident happened. I think this was in 2000, 3 or 4 years ago. I went 2015. I had started writing my book, so I went to India after the writers' retreat and wanting to talk to her. But some of my cousins said, "Hey, she's slipping in and out of dementia. She may remember you, may not." I said, "Okay, let me just go." So I went, and my younger brother, my half brother's wife was there, and she took me into the room where my mother was, and I was told that my mother was not recognizing people at all. So my sister-in-law propped me in front of my mother and said, "Mommy, do you know who this is?" And then she, gave my sister-in-law a very disgusted look and said, "What do you mean know who she is? Of course I know who she is. She's my daughter, Boo Boo, and that's my nickname."
Wow.
So, that was the first time she had acknowledged me in public. But
How did you feel? How did you feel about that?
That was when I realized that maybe she hadn't made peace with what she had done. because she had stopped recognizing her own husband. She would, he would be by her side, and she would tell people, "Who's the strange person sitting next to me?" So that was, that I felt was, maybe that's, she regretted what she did. And so for me, I think my closure came at that point, that I can't change things now. I can't go back 40, 50 years into history and say, okay, here. But so I rested it there. I said, okay, she's paid her price, whatever.
So why did you write your book, A Fractured Life?
Many reasons. And the first reason I wrote it was, to prove that I exist. Because all my life, nobody, like I said, even my half siblings didn't know who I was. They just found out 10 years ago. So all my life, I have been nobody's daughter. Like, I've, nobody saying, okay, she was my daughter, or she's my this, or she's my that. Nothing. It was always this mystery that surrounded me. People were told not to talk about me. I was not mentioned in, my mother's circle or her husband's circle or their family circle, even though the whole town knew who I was. But it was never addressed. So for me, that was the main reason. I'm like, I existed. You guys extinguished me. You guys made me feel I was nobody. So that's my main reason of writing the book was that. And the second reason is, all these people who, talk about, oh, they got a divorce, oh, this happened, that happened. There's no shame in it. You create shame means you're stifling somebody's life. Things like this do happen. Let's be open about it. Let's talk about it. Mental abuse happens. Physical abuse happens. But if you keep shutting the doors on it, it's just going to churn inside there. So that was another reason I wrote it, that, yes, I'm a child of divorce. Yes, I had abuse in my marriage. Yes, I was not perfect, but still, we all have a right to survive. And that's the reason I wrote the book.
Do you, Shabnam Samuel, by writing this book, feel visible now?
Absolutely.
I'm happy to hear that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so
now,
much.
Now, I have to ask you, whose picture is on the front page of your book?
That's me, actually. That was me, and I'm hoping one day you read my book. That picture
That's
is
the
significant. That picture is significant because right after that picture was taken, my life changed in a lot of ways. I think the decisions I made, or the decisions that were made for me, came right after that picture. And right after that picture, I had a major surgery, and that completely changed my life and everything else. So I won't give away too much. Once you read the book, you'll know.
I hope we haven't given away too much, but I think what we've done is we've inspired other people to read your very compelling and at times very painful and unusual life story. And I think that our viewers will all go buy the book, A Fractured Life by Shabnam Samuel. I guess that they can find it on Amazon and other online bookstores or even in bookstores. Is that right?
Indie book. Yes, correct. Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, yes.
Shabnam Samuel, this has been an absolutely phenomenal interview for me. I kept myself from crying on the camera, and I'm proud of myself on that. And what I'm also proud of you, and I'm sure our founder, the Shamiran Media founder, Mariam Shamalta, is also proud of you and very grateful to you for documenting a part of the Assyrian history that without you could have been lost forever. And as you know by now, I'm sure you've done quite a bit of research. The Assyrian genocide is one of the least known genocides and at times denied genocides. And we Assyrians are very hungry for anyone to just write a sentence or say something about how we were wronged and we are still being wronged. And that is why we are grateful to you. And you may be a quarter Assyrian. To me, you're all the way Assyrian, and I hope you do not disconnect yourself from our community. We love you. We want you with us with open arms. You've done something magnificent for us. And please, do not let you be lost like Susember Rasho was. We've gained both of you back, and thank you. Thank you for this interview.
Thank you so much. My heart is full.